At around 6 in the morning on May 16, 1968, a woman in a London tower block struck a match to light her stove for a cup of tea. She had no idea gas had been quietly leaking into her flat overnight. The explosion that followed didn't just destroy her apartment, it took out an entire corner of a 22-story building, floor by floor, in a matter of seconds. By the 1960s, Britain faced a serious housing shortage, and local councils turned to a new approach: fast, cheap, prefabricated tower blocks built using a method called the large panel system. Instead of pouring concrete on site or building with a steel frame, entire wall and floor sections were manufactured off-site as large precast concrete panels, then assembled like a kit of parts. Ronan Point in Newham, East London, was one of these towers, 22 stories tall, completed on March 11, 1968. It was part of a wave of similar buildings across the UK, seen at the time as the modern solution to housing shortages. The building was still only partially occupied when, just 2 months after completion, resident Ivy Hodge woke up in her 18th floor corner flat and lit a match to make tea, unaware a gas leak had built up overnight. Here's the structural choice that turned a small kitchen explosion into a building-wide collapse. In a traditional framed building, steel or reinforced concrete beams and columns form a skeleton. The walls are essentially just infill, not load-bearing. If something damages a wall, the frame itself usually keeps standing. Ronan Point had no such frame. Its precast concrete panels were the structure, load-bearing walls and floors stacked and joined directly to each other, story after story, with no independent skeleton behind them. This system had been designed originally for buildings around 6 stories tall. Ronan Point was 22. That mattered because of what engineers call redundancy, a building's ability to reroute load if one part fails. A framed building has it built in. Ronan Point's panel system did not. Each panel depended on the ones around it, and there was no backup path for the weight above to travel if a panel failed. Investigators, after the collapse, also found the construction itself hadn't fully matched the design specifications. Joints that were supposed to be solidly filled were found stuffed with newspaper and rubble instead of proper structural material, and some connecting bolts weren't properly tightened. But officially, the inquiry's most damning finding was broader than any one construction shortcut. This kind of cumulative failure was, in their words, inherent in the design itself. The gas explosion in Ivy Hodge's flat was, by structural standards, relatively minor. It knocked her across the room, but she survived, largely unharmed. The problem wasn't the size of the blast. It was what the blast touched. The explosion blew out a load-bearing wall panel on the corner of the 18th floor. With that panel gone, the floors above, 19 through 22, lost their support on that corner and collapsed downward, crashing onto the 18th floor below. That impact was more than floor 18 could bear. Its own corner panel gave way under the sudden weight, sending everything crashing down onto 17. Then 17 gave way onto 16. The failure repeated itself, floor after floor, all the way down to the ground, a domino effect engineers now call progressive collapse, a term that entered the structural engineering vocabulary largely because of this event. 4 to 5 people were killed, and around 17 others were injured. Given that an entire corner of a 22-story residential tower came down, the death toll was as low as it was, almost entirely because the building was still only partially occupied at the time. The public inquiry that followed Ronan Point's collapse became a landmark moment in structural engineering, not because the initial explosion was unusual, but because of how completely disproportionate the response was. A minor domestic gas explosion should never be capable of bringing down a corner of a building, floor by floor, all the way to the ground. The inquiry concluded the solution wasn't to prevent every possible gas leak. That's not realistic in any building with gas appliances. The solution was to design buildings so that a local failure stays local. Their key recommendation was to introduce proper structural ties between panels, steel reinforcement connecting each section to its neighbors, so that if one panel failed, the load could redistribute through the connections around it instead of simply falling straight through, floor after floor. There's a quiet irony at the center of this story. The failure started with something almost absurdly mundane, a woman making tea, a leak she had no way of knowing about. But it exposed a systemic vulnerability across an entire generation of buildings built the same way, all across the country. Ronan Point was repaired and reinforced after the collapse, but confidence in it never fully recovered. The tower was eventually demolished in 1986. More broadly, its collapse effectively ended the UK's enthusiasm for large panel system tower blocks. Construction using this method largely stopped. The regulatory changes were direct and lasting. Building codes were rewritten to require structural ties between panels in this kind of construction, and new standards required buildings to be able to withstand a specified explosive or accidental load without progressive collapse. Gas installations in high-rise buildings came under much stricter regulation, eventually leading to the professional certification standards UK gas engineers still work under today. Ronan Point is still taught in engineering programs as the case that gave a name to an entire category of structural failure. The moment engineers had to reckon with the simple truth: a building should never let a small survivable accident become a much larger, unsurvivable one.